Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea's new daily COVID-19 cases are forecast to drop into the 4,000 range on Monday as Christmas and the brutally cold weather prompted far fewer people to get tested. South Korea also to decide whether to approve oral COVID-19 treatment pills by Pfizer and Merck. Over 7,000 flights around the world are cancelled over the Christmas holiday. The reason? The explosive growth in the number of new Omicron cases, especially in Europe and North America. Plus, tributes flood in from around the world as South Africa's anti-apartheid hero Archbishop Desmond Tutu dies. He was 90 years old. Stay tuned for these stories and more.
Hello and welcome to this Monday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on December 27th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the course of the next hour or so, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. We are going to start, though, with the latest on the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in South Korea, the nation's Ministry of Food and Drug Safety is scheduled to announce its decision on whether to authorize Pfizer and Merck's oral COVID-19 pills for emergency use in this country.
For more on this and other COVID-19 updates is our reporter Han Sung-woo in the studio with us. Good morning, Sung-woo.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, Sung-woo, like we just said, we're expecting the South Korean government to give the green light to Merck and Pfizer's oral treatments today. Tell us more on that.
That's right, Mogan. That announcement is scheduled to be made this afternoon at around 1 o'clock. If everything goes well, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety gives the okay, if they give the okay. Pfizer's Paxlovid and Merck's Molnupiravir may be used by patients here in the country as early as late January. The government has currently procured or is in the final stages of procuring at least 542,000 courses of the treatments. 300,000 from Pfizer and 242,000 from Merck. Once given the green light to be distributed across the country, they'll be prescribed to patients recovering at home and those with mild to moderate symptoms. The United States Food and Drug Administration earlier authorized both pills for emergency use last week.
And Sung-woo, can you give us the latest on the tally of new infections we might be expecting in South Korea today?
Of course, we're expected to see at around 4,000 cases reported today once the official daily tally comes out later in the morning. Health authorities marked up to 3,774 new cases up to 9 p.m. Sunday, more than 1,000 less compared to the same time both the day before and a week earlier. Officials have been saying recently that the resurgence seems to be on a downward trend now, thanks to more and more people receiving booster shots and the strict antivirus curbs currently in place across the country.
Now, Sung-woo, tell us more about how much Omicron has spread around the country.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the Omicron variant is everywhere. What I mean by that is that Omicron has been detected in every province in Korea except Chungcheongnam-do province. As of Sunday, the total number of cases stands at 376, not as high as it is in Western countries, of course, but concerning nonetheless, considering 215 of those cases are local transmissions, many of them coming from unknown infection routes. Authorities say it's inevitable that Omicron will become the dominant strain in the country, likely by February next year.
Okay, well, that's quite surprising. We were told it was much more transmissible. I would have thought it might have been the dominant strain much faster than that, but we're going to speak to an expert on that in just a moment. But this variant, this Omicron, has become a real obstacle for people who want to try and travel abroad, correct?
That is correct. According to flight tracker Flight Aware, a total of 7,202 flights were canceled worldwide in the 3-day period from Christmas Eve to the 26th of December. A huge chunk, more than 2,000 of those canceled flights were trips either departing from or arriving in the United States. Aside from international travel restrictions, American media outlets are also reporting that the airline industry has also been heavily hit by infections among pilots, flight attendants, and other industry insiders, rendering them unable to work.
Now, Seung-woo, speaking of the U.S., how is the Omicron situation over there?
Very bad, I must say. For the first time in almost a year, the U.S. is seeing a daily average of more than 200,000 COVID-19 infections, and the Omicron variant's accounting for the vast majority of them. Data compiled by the New York Times shows the daily average of new COVID-19 cases in the country over 7 days hit 201,330. That's a 69% increase from 2 weeks prior. A particularly worrying trend is the rise in infections among minors. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, COVID-19 infections among those under 18 as of December 16th had risen by 170,000 from a week earlier.
All right, Seung-woo, let's hope the situation gets better. Thank you so much for your report today. Hope we talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, let's move on to On Point. This is the part in the program where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. What else could be more in the spotlight than COVID-19, unfortunately? South Korea's new daily COVID-19 cases remained under 6,000 for the second straight day Sunday due to fewer people taking tests on Christmas Day. And as we just heard from our Han Sang-woo there, we are expecting around 4,000 today, so quite a decline. However, the number of critical cases remains worryingly high. South Korean health authorities say the number of critically ill edged down a touch on Sunday, but the number is still close to 1,100. The number of Omicron cases now slightly over 375, but it must be said that this new variant has been spreading much more slower in South Korea than it has been doing in other countries.
For more on this, we connect to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Ms. Midi Women's Hospital in Seoul. Good morning, Dr. Tan.
Good morning.
So let's start with critically ill patients. The government has been ordering patients out of ICUs as hospitals face a severe shortage of beds. Now, considering some patients are not well enough to be moved on day 20 and some have since died, are there alternative ways that wouldn't require patients to arbitrarily move after 20 days?
Well, thank you for asking this very important question. And I think this really indicates how severe the COVID situation is in Korea. Basically, we've had to shift our paradigm towards critical care from one of first come, first serve to now we are triaging our patients to try to get maximal benefit of limited resources. In fact, in Italy, they've had discussions about this situation since the early stages of the pandemic, when they had a surge of cases that caused some of their healthcare systems to collapse. And as a result, in the entire country, they've had an open debate and discussion about this issue, and they came up with some guidelines that were published in January of 2021 regarding how to triage critical care for patients who need an ICU space when space is limited. And basically their criteria depended on, of course, the patient's overall condition and how severely ill they were, also the number of comorbidities and the type of comorbidities that the patient had, the patient's pre-illness functional status. Importantly, they also considered whether or not the patient had something called an advance directive or had expressed wishes about how they wanted their medical care to be conducted if they were in a situation where they were on a respirator, for example. And then, of course, we also considered in Italy the impact of intensive care and whether or not it was futile or would be helpful, beneficial for the patient. And once these guidelines were published, I think it set a pretty good framework for which ICU directors could think about where they should place their patients. I think in Korea, the Korean Society for Critical Care Medicine, they have initiated this type of discussion. But so far in Korea, we have not published any similar guidelines, and I think it is overdue.
Right. So basically, what you're suggesting, maybe take a leaf out of Italy's book, because it seems kind of nonsensical to me that a patient who might be in ICU for 15 days but has gotten much better, whereas a patient who's been in ICU for 20 days but is still seriously ill has to move. But moving on to our next question. The Prime Minister here has reportedly committed to securing an additional 10,000 hospital beds, these for patients with moderate to serious symptoms but not critically ill by the middle of next month. Now, if this wasn't an option all along, if this was an option all along, why wasn't it done earlier? And couldn't more ICU beds also be brought in? I know there is an issue with the understaffed hospitals as well.
I'm not exactly sure where this number 10,000 is coming from. It sounds more like magical or wishful thinking rather than based on any reality of actual hospital bed space and the number of personnel that are available to adequately take care of 10,000 more patients. I mean, this raises a very important point, though. Obviously, we do need to prepare for an imminent surge of COVID patients due to the Omicron variant. But I will say that since 2015, so that's almost 7 years now, doctors in Korea have been asking for a freestanding infectious disease specialty hospital to take care of patients with highly communicable diseases, which is, what we have going on right now. And if we had heeded these requests, 7 years ago, or even 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, we wouldn't be in quite the situation that we are in now. We do need to prepare more beds, more bed space, but 10,000 seems a little bit unrealistic to me, even though the need is there.
And also, Dr. Tan, given the recent surge, social distancing measures were introduced that last until at least January 2nd. No more than 4 people can gather, and restaurants, cafes, and bars are forced to close by 9 p.m. Given we haven't seen much of a change and small business owners' livelihoods are on the line, should the government consider lifting the restrictions, or do you foresee them being extended again?
There are 2 currencies that we're dealing with in the pandemic right now. The first is an economic impact, of course. So it's money, it's businesses, it's livelihoods. But the second currency is in actual human lives. Since we embarked on this stepwise return to normal, November 1st, there have been more than 2,300 COVID-19 deaths in our country. And so we need to have an open, honest discussion about what to expect if we do decrease restrictions. I don't think the public was, made aware of what the situation would be when we started the program on November 1st. So I think it's time that we have a realistic expectation about what will happen and have a discussion. But from my point of view, given the imminent surge of cases due to Omicron and also the saturation of medical resources that we have right now, I don't think that it will be safe for our country to ease restrictions further. In fact, I think it would be wiser to tighten restrictions so that we don't have such a burden on our healthcare systems.
And finally, Doctor, we are unfortunately running out of time, but Omicron has yet to make itself really known here in South Korea. It's completely spread across numerous other countries. Why do you think this is the case in South Korea?
I think this is entirely a matter of underdetection and underreporting. So in Korea, we only report confirmed and epidemiologically probable cases. We don't report all of the cases which have PCR S gene target failure defects. Right now, if we calculate both the epidemiological probable and confirmed cases, that's over 500. It's actually 553 as of yesterday. Once we start running the PCR tests that detect the Omicron variant from the get-go, and I think we're starting on Thursday, we will start to see a significant rise in the number of reported cases. So I think everyone needs to know we have many more cases under the radar. It's not that we have Omicron under control. It's just a matter of under detection.
All right, Dr. Tan, as always, we're grateful for your insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, moving on to our next story. South Korea's economy this year, according to the latest projection from the IMF, is on course to solidify its position as the 10th biggest in the world.
The IMF projects GDP to come to $1,824 billion US, most likely enough to keep the 10th place spot. In 2022, GDP is expected to grow to $1.9 trillion, which again would make it the 10th biggest for a third year in a row. Korea first broke into the top 10 in 2020, the first year of the pandemic, in large part thanks to the smaller economic losses it endured relative to other countries, having avoided strict lockdowns and other disruptions. South Korea's trade minister says the government is ready to meet standards for membership of the CPTPP, a free trade agreement between 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Speaking to a Japanese news outlet, Yohan-gu said Seoul is ready to meet the high standards required to join and has been preparing for the past 8 years. The minister also said that if South Korea joins the Free Trade Pact, it would vitalize economic cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo. His remarks come after a Japanese official said this month that it's too early to comment on whether South Korea can meet the pact's high standards. The accumulated net purchases of South Korean retail stock investors hit a fresh record high this year, surpassing $86 billion. The most in-demand shares were Samsung Electronics and Tesla. Kim Hyo-sun has more.
Individual investors in South Korea continue to be net buyers of local and overseas stocks in 2021. Korea Exchange said they bought a record amount exceeding 100 trillion Korean won, or some $86 billion in total. This is the first time for the accumulated net purchases of Korean retail investors to surpass the milestone. About 75% of the shares they bought were local, worth $64.5 billion. The other quarter were foreign. Their accumulated net purchases of shares on the benchmark Kospi for 2021 hovered around $55 billion, up 38% from the previous year. The most popular local stock was Samsung Electronics, which accounted for nearly half of the total net purchases. Overseas, Tesla was most in demand.
Despite the relatively big swings, Tesla is one American firm that has recorded the biggest gains this year. Korean investors' appetite for the EV market also prompted them to buy a lot of Tesla's stock.
However, the Kospi indices grew less than 5% this year as of Friday, compared to the same period last year, underperforming markets in other countries, the U.S. in particular. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in will meet in the coming hours with the heads of the country's conglomerates for a luncheon at the Blue House. The list of companies includes Samsung Electronics, Hyundai Motor, SK, LG, POSCO, and KT. They've been taking part in a campaign with the government to create jobs and provide training to young people. The Blue House said the luncheon was arranged to thank them for their commitment and to discuss plans going forward. The 6 companies have agreed to create some 179,000 jobs over the next 3 years and provide training opportunities. It will be the first time President Moon has met with Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong since he was released on parole in August.
Now we are going to cross over to our OCR for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. And this week, we wrap up the biggest stories of 2021 as we head into the new year. First, beginning with the U.S. China rivalry stretching across all fields from trade and technology to values and development. Well, former President George Bush called Beijing a strategic competitor, but now the U.S. has named it the #1 threat to America's national security. And the two sides have not been able to narrow their differences throughout the year. And we review the situation with Dr. J. James Kim, Director of ASAN Institute for Policy Studies, specialising in American politics and policy. It's lovely to see you again, Dr. Kim. How was your Christmas?
Nice to see you. It was family time, and Merry Christmas to you and everyone else at Arirang.
Thank you. A very belated Merry Christmas to you too. And well, okay, getting straight into the questions now. Firstly, we've heard the term Thucydides trap being used quite often in recent years. What is your position on this theory? Do you think the US and China are structurally destined for war?
So the origin of the theory goes back about 1,600 years, and it's in reference to the Peloponnesian War, which was fought between Athens and Sparta. The name Thucydides refers to the Athenian historian who took note of this event and authored a book about the incident. In it, he describes a war that Athens and Sparta fought largely because an established power, in this case Sparta, felt threatened by a rising power, which at the time was Athens. And the lesson from this history is that a disruption in our international balance of power can lead to war. And the Thucydides trap is a term coined by Graham Allison, as you noted, which describes this theory. So fast forward to today, what we have post-Cold War is an international system that has been moving from a bipolar competition between Soviet Union and US, followed by a hegemonic world order under US dominance, moving to yet another bipolar or even multipolar world dominated once again by great power competition involving China, the US, maybe even Europe or Russia. And I think the jury's still out on Allison's claim that the U.S. and China is structurally destined for war. And I guess it's important to define what we mean by war, but it's definitely a competition and one that has the potential to develop into a kinetic conflict.
And well, amid this competition, Dr. Kim, we're seeing a growing military build-up around the South China Sea, and there's been growing concerns that this might actually escalate into full-scale war. And well, amid all this, the US Congress, they passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and they actually added $2.1 billion to the Defense Department's budget request for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, with lawmakers emphasizing the importance of this initiative for the security of the Indo-Pacific. So what would this initiative actually entail?
So a bit of context. Congress approved the largest U.S. defense budget in history just recently, and amounts to about $778 billion. Some of this is obviously linked to the rise in price we saw over the last year due to inflation, but as you noted, we can't leave China out of the discussion. And PDI, or Pacific Deterrence Initiative, certainly accounts for some of this, with about $7.1 billion, which is about 1% of the total budget. Still, significant. About $4.7 billion of that is allocated to augmenting the U.S. naval strength, and $3.5 billion for additional military-related, base-related expenses. I think the move certainly signals the seriousness about China, but the budget line item itself is relatively small in relation to other spending items. But if you look more deeply into the broader budget, I think you can say that Congress has increased spending in other areas that matters more. And we see the focus is squarely on China. For instance, Congress has increased the research and development spending in the DoD budget to $118 billion, which is about $6 billion more than what the Biden administration proposed. A lot of that is focused on China. So I think you need to take a broader look at other items in the DoD spending to better assess the sentiment and the seriousness that the U.S. is giving to China. And what's interesting about this development is that this is all happening under a Democratic president and Congress that have traditionally been less supportive of a hawkish defense policy.
And well, China, on its part, it's also been building up its naval capabilities, its nuclear capabilities even, and many are worried that this is actually going to end up in a clash, whether it's whether it's intended or whether it's accidental. How do you see the possibility of actual warfare? Do you think any of the two sides would go to war over Taiwan?
If you look at all possible dyadic relationships among approximately 200 states around the world over the last 100, 200 years, the number of years that these countries have been at war with each other have been less than the number of years under peace. So overall, wars are less likely than what some people may claim. But compared to where things were in 1993 to today, we can certainly say that the risk of great power conflict is greater today than it was before. And Taiwan is certainly one area that seems to be heating up, and it has been this way for some time now. While it isn't clear whether we would be facing a war over Taiwan in the next month or two, I think the mood in China and the U.S. certainly seems to be that both sides are gearing up for some kind of escalation event over Taiwan.
And do you think security pacts like AUKUS that was formed in September and these other sort of mini-lateral naval exercises that we're seeing in the region will be effective in pressuring and perhaps containing China?
In answering that question, I think it's important for us to understand the factors that are motivating China's rise. And from the U.S. perspective, I think the view is that it has less to do with what the world is doing or not doing about China's rise and more to do with what China is doing internally to position itself as a future-oriented economy for the 21st century. So the short answer to your question about containing China is that no, these cooperative frameworks are less likely to contain China's rise than what they are really designed to do, which is to pressure, but a better characterization, I think, is that they're likely to keep China in check, if not keep the free democratic world at pace with China's growth and expansion. So the effectiveness and the success with which these countries would be able to do this will depend largely on how robust and stable these cooperative frameworks are as we move into the future.
Well, US President Biden, he's been rallying allies in Asia and other friends of America to reinforce democracy and other Western-led liberal values in their countries. But in the recent Summit for Democracy that we saw last month, many of the governments, particularly from the ASEAN region, they're not entirely democratic, are they? In fact, they've recently demonstrated a retreat from democratic values. Do you think this value-based approach is going to actually get countries on America's side?
I think you're right. At the moment, it doesn't look so clear. It seems that advanced democratic countries are aligned with this view for now. But again, this will depend on the extent to which democratic tendencies can continue in the future. We saw a lot of domestic trend towards adopting nationalist or less globalist approach to foreign policy over the last 4 to 5 years. We saw some of this trend affecting South Korea as well. The question is whether this trend will continue in other parts of the world, for the next 5 to 10 years. I think countries like Australia, Japan, UK, and Biden-led US, among others, appear to be banking on this belief to the extent that they're emphasizing values. But countries in other parts around the world, including ASEAN, are less aligned with this view for now. I think this is in some ways motivated by a belief that these countries do not necessarily see China or the US and the Western world as a threat to their national interests just yet. If and when these countries start to recognize one or more of these powers as a threat, I think they will start making, choices about questions related to values and democracy.
And well, Dr. Kim, some pointed out the irony of years and years of democratic progress being reversed in some countries, in Myanmar and Afghanistan most notably this year. And there was also criticism over the lack of action from the West to defend democracy in these countries, as well as some concern over China's influence over the Myanmar junta as well as the Taliban. Do you think this sort of marks the end of the unipolar world led by America?
I think you're right. I think it is clear that we're nearing the end, if not We have already passed over the end of era of bipolar or unipolar dominance by the U.S. We can look to different examples of this already playing out in countries like South Korea, where when the government senses sufficient pressure to not take out an independent voice on matters like national defense and foreign policy. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying.
And speaking of South Korea, Seoul, along with a number of European countries like Germany and the UK, they've shown willingness to cooperate with Quad Plus initiatives. And but then at the same time, despite surveys showing a high level of distrust towards China among the South Korean public, the current administration is eager to maintain good relations with Beijing. Do you think South Korea is going to be able to hedge as it did in the past, or do you think the pressure from both sides is going to be quite unmanageable?
I think the countries will be forced to make some hard choices, and hedging and hoping is not going to be an effective strategy when tensions between U.S. and China escalate. So what we need in South Korea is strong leadership and a clear strategy now more than ever.
And while the Biden administration, there's been a lot of interest over how he's going to do things hopefully differently from the previous Trump administration's trade policies. And so far, he hasn't shown that much interest in joining the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Deal, CPTPP. Do you think America is planning on any kind of economic initiatives for the Indo-Pacific region?
I think the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has made some public statements that the U.S. isn't committed yet to CPTPP. But what the U.S. has expressed interest in are establishment of standards for investment and trade that will be less tolerant of trade with China, that compromises U.S. trade, U.S. interests, or U.S. national security. So some things already underway are investment standards related to technology. I think digital trade agreements of some kind is something that the U.S. is looking to expand in the Indo-Pacific. It already has an agreement like this that focuses on digital trade with countries like Japan. I also think that export and investment controls, much like CFIUS, is something that countries like Japan and Australia are also participating in, and there's likely to be moves to expand this kind of cooperative arrangements with other countries in the region. But I don't see a multilateral framework being developed here. A lot of this is either minilateral or bilateral.
And Dr. Kim, the US has tried to stop a hegemon from arising in the Asia region, but with the region spanning so many countries, all with very diverse characteristics and interests, do you think it will be possible for one power to actually dominate the region? I mean, how do you see the future of the hegemonic competition affecting the region politically and economically?
So a bit of context. I think what we had with the US over the last 7 decades, since the end of World War II, was a real ideal situation for Asia. You had Soviet Union and China threatening for dominance in the region for much of that time. There were certainly moments when these powers could have succeeded in rolling back U.S. influence in the region. We saw that, for example, in the Korean Peninsula and Vietnam, for instance. And the U.S. record in the region wasn't always great, as we saw in Vietnam and Korea. But what we saw was that U.S. was continuing to challenge these moves and do so to the extent that these moves to roll back U.S. influence did not continue beyond these theaters. And I think what we are seeing with these unilateral cooperation and changes in regulatory standards is that the U.S. wants to keep pace with China's rise and establish a new balance in world order. And what this means is that we should expect changes and expect moments of heightened tension and escalation. Countries will eventually be asked to make hard choices that will affect their society and economy. And to this extent, I think South Korea should take these changes seriously and chart out our course based on principled objectives and strategies that will promote our national interest.
Well, that was Dr. J. James Kim, Director of ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you so much for your time, your wonderful insights throughout the year, and have a very happy new year.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you and everyone at Arirang.
Thank you.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned he will consider various options if the West fails to meet his proposed security guarantees. Putin has been saying Moscow will have to take adequate military technical measures if the West continues its aggressive course on Russia's doorstep. As to specify what these measures might be, he told Russian state TV on Sunday that they can be, quote, diverse. The US and its allies are refusing to offer Putin the kind of guarantees he wants, citing NATO's principle that membership is open to any qualifying country. Tottenham Hotspur on Sunday cruised to a convincing 3-0 home win over Crystal Palace, which included an 8th English Premier League goal of the season for South Korean star Heung-min. With Harry Kane and Lucas Moura scoring in the first half, Son's 74th-minute goal sealed the victory for Tottenham. Son has now found the back of the net in 4 straight games for the North London club. Having won 4 of the last 5 league matches, Spurs are now 6 points off 4th place. Netflix's new Korean series, The Silent Sea, ranked 7th on the platform's top TV shows chart soon after its release on Christmas Eve. According to Flix Patrol, which provides worldwide streaming statistics, Silent Sea was the most watched show in South Korea, while it ranked 3rd in Thailand and Singapore. The mystery sci-fi thriller set in the future when Earth suffers from a lack of water and food is about a special team tasked with finding out the secrets of an abandoned research facility on the moon. It's based on a short Korean film called The Sea of Tranquility that was released in 2014.
It was Christmas over the weekend. While many families gathered together and children opened gifts, there were plenty who couldn't enjoy the festivities. Despite having one of the lowest birth rates in the world, South Korea is still home to thousands of children in need of a family. Shin Yeun has this story.
Helping each child stay with their biological parents has been the underlying principle of the country's child welfare law. While some parents have been persuaded to raise their own child, many children are still in need of a family. Local governments are the first to protect these children at temporary care facilities. Then some are sent to adoption agencies. And under the Special Adoption Act, children are first assigned to domestic households. Those who aren't matched domestically are then matched with families abroad. And children who aren't adopted end up at facilities like this one.
In fact, about 6 out of 10 children end up there. The president of one of the country's oldest facilities said this issue needs to be addressed.
Growing up as an orphan myself, I've received so much help from facilities like the one I'm operating now. But South Korea shouldn't have to rely on these facilities for children. Instead, government should invest in creating the right infrastructure for parents to raise their own child.
To try and achieve this, the Ministry of Health and Welfare launched the National Center for the Rights of the Child in 2019 to impose policies that would accommodate the basic needs and best interests of each child. Before, the NCRC was known as the Korea Adoption Services, a private organization providing child welfare-related services.
In 2019, the government decided to strengthen its role in protecting children. Before individuals or private organizations determine whether a child in need of a family should go to an adoption agency or through the foster care system. Now the local government scrutinizes what will be the most appropriate and safe haven for each child.
The adoptive parents I talked to said they appreciated the Korean government's efforts.
We really appreciate Korean government. They really put kids in the foster care system, and 2 of my kids, they are loved by their foster family. We cry so hard on the custody day, and until today, we still keep in touch.
Korea was, they just had a really improved and like a strict kind of adoption process, which we really respected. They basically really focus on the well-being of the children and where they're going.
Like that whole education portion up until we took custody was just like very rigorous. It taught us a lot. I think it tried to adjust our expectations a lot. And it tried to prepare us.
Adopters have to do loads of paperwork, medical and psychological examinations. And international parents must take weeks off work to fly into Korea and meet their court and custody dates. While parents were more than willing to go through all these steps to welcome a new child into their household, they did hope the process could be sped up a bit.
Once the match is set, if that could be somehow expedited, just because we feel like the sooner the child's able to be with the adoptive parents, maybe the better, that the families have of attaching and bringing them home.
I adopted 2 children, my older son in 2018 and my daughter in 2020. When I adopted my son for the first time, I agreed that the hours of training and paperwork were all necessary. But I was a bit surprised that I was asked the same psych evaluation questions and had to do the same social worker visits all over again when adopting my daughter less than 2 years later. We had to wait 5 more months to adopt our daughter than when we adopted our son because of that incident.
The incident she's referring to is the death of an adopted child named Heung-min. In October 2020, a 16-month-old baby girl died after being physically abused by her adoptive parents. Thousands went to the streets demanding that the government better protect children from abuse, but many connected the wrong dots. Some said Heung-min had died because she had been adopted.
Many adoptive families, including ourselves, were enraged. Heung-min died from neglect and child abuse, not adoption. The adoption process had been lengthened to evaluate and prevent adoptive parents from doing such a thing. But this incident shouldn't have focused on whether Heung-min was biologically related to the parents or not.
To tackle this stereotype, MPAC Korea, an institution short for the mission to promote adoption of kids, has been launching anti-prejudice classes at schools in Korea from the early 2000s.
Our catchphrase is adoption is just another way of making a family. We teach people that adopted children shouldn't be pitied. The only difference adopted parents have with biological parents is that they aren't blood related. Adopted parents actually go through even more training and preparation to bring a child into their lives.
I think the government should realize that adoptive parents want to also ensure a safe and smooth transition for our child. We want to make sure our child adjusts to his or her new home and feels safe here.
That's why many adopters sought counseling.
Recognizing a demand, we started to provide free therapy sessions to adoptive families. Some key topics discussed are how parents can handle when their child has post-trauma or separation anxiety.
As of now, post-adoption services, including therapy or counseling, are limited to adoptive families in the country. But international families have also voiced their demand for this type of service.
When you invest so much, just emotionally, however, to bring your child home, then there should be some aftercare. Now, every 3 months for the first year, South Korea, they do send a home study social worker to your house. But you do pay for that. I think it was like around $400. Basically, it's not to help you out, but it's to see, are you treating this child well? And they write up a report and send it to the Korean agents. But that had nothing to do with giving us any kind of therapy.
The NCRC said they would try to accommodate their needs.
We have been linking international adopted parents to one another, providing classes on Korean culture and events where families that adopt could learn more about the child's traditional roots. And now that we know that there is a demand for counseling and therapy services for parents and children abroad, we will try to meet that need as well.
Lawmakers have been amending the Special Adoption Act numerous times and are still looking for areas of improvement.
To raise awareness and protect our children, we need to constantly look into what we can do. That's why lawmakers, including myself, are making a motion to amend the Special Adoption Act or relative welfare policies to meet the best interests and safety of each child.
But there's still some babies left abandoned on the streets. Just a few days ago, an infant was found dead in a clothing bin. If that child had been placed in this box, also known as a baby box, he would have survived.
Babies found are protected at the facility until the local government comes to pick them up.
A siren goes off as soon as the box opens. We then rush out before the mother or father leaves. We bring most of them inside and show them just how we could help them raise their own child. That could be financial support or providing a temporary place to stay. 1 out of 5 are persuaded and take their child back home.
Despite good intentions, the baby box system has stirred controversy. Some civic groups said the box allows more people to abandon their babies. They said it hinders adoption because under the adoption law, biological mothers must register their newborn for them to be adopted.
These parents aren't abandoning their child. They're actually trying to save them. We too run out as soon as the box opens to ask the mother or father for the name and birth date of this child. At the end of the day, I think all civic groups, adoption agencies, local governments and facilities want the same thing: to save as many lives as possible and make sure every child is safe and happy.
신예은, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. South Africa mourns the loss of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who died at the age of 90 on Sunday. A Nobel Peace Prize laureate and a veteran of South Africa's struggle against white minority rule, leaders from around the world paid tribute. Throughout the 1980s, Tutu brought focus on the suffering of South Africa's black majority under white rule, urging sanctions against a government clinging to power in the face of rising international opposition. He was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984 for his nonviolent campaign to win racial equality for his people in South Africa. However, as he continued to push for negotiations and peaceful protests, he also made enemies at both sides. Black radicals accused him of compromising with apartheid, while the supporters of apartheid saw him as a threat. All that aside, Tutu has long been considered a voice of integrity and is often remembered as one of the leading voices against apartheid, who was also not afraid of condemning injustice whenever he saw it. 2 dams gave way in the northeastern Brazilian state of Bahia after weeks of heavy rain. The Iguá Dam collapsed on Saturday night, leading authorities to evacuate at-risk residents, while a second dam, Jacuípe, collapsed Sunday morning, bringing more alerts for residents to move to safer ground. While there were no reports of deaths or injuries, bridges and roads were damaged. According to Bahia Governor Rui Castro, at least 400,000 people have been impacted by the heavy rains. The heavy rainfall, which has lasted for almost 2 months now, have been responsible for 18 casualties in Bahia. The Taliban continue to add restrictions for women, this time banning them from traveling distances farther than 72 kilometers, unless accompanied by a male family member. According to the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice on Sunday, women seeking to travel anything other than short distances should not be offered transport if they are alone, and offers should only be made to those wearing Islamic hijabs. The latest measures also specify that the males accompanying the women must be close relatives. The guidance, which circulated on social media networks, comes weeks after the ministry forced television channels to stop showing dramas and soap operas featuring female actors. Since taking power in August, the Taliban have imposed a number of restrictions on women and girls, despite pledging to soften rules compared to their period in power in the 1990s. 이승재, Arirang News.
Good morning. What a Christmas weekend we had across Korea. Weather-wise, Seoul is going through the coldest time in 41 years, while Gangwon-do, Jeollado, and Jeju Island saw massive snowfall. And it's another brutally cold start to the day in most regions, with cold wave alerts remain in place. Meanwhile, a heavy snow advisory remains in effect in Jeollado and Jeju Island. Because more snow is expected there through this afternoon, so please be careful out on the roads. And also there could be flurries in parts of Chungcheong, Namdo, and Gyeonggi-do provinces during the day. Cover up from head to toe. Sharp winds are making things colder than these actual temperatures. And even Gwangju and Busan started out the day at -7 degrees. But this afternoon, readings will be about 5 to 8 degrees higher than yesterday. A big jump in Seoul from yesterday's -7 to 1 degree Celsius this afternoon. The cold snap eases tomorrow afternoon, then another round of bone-chilling weather is in the forecast as we head towards the weekend. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Tuesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-kyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for joining us. I'll be back with our next newscast at 10 a.m. Korea time. Until then, goodbye.